The cold afternoon clung to Los Angeles like a dense fog, its chill sinking deep into the bones of anyone left exposed to its unforgiving bite. The sun was no longer the comforting orb it had once been, but a distant, indifferent source of light barely visible through the haze of dust and smoke in the city's neglected corners. One of those corners, perhaps the most tragic of all, was Skid Row, a place that existed in a shadow of forgotten lives, a graveyard for hopes and dreams discarded in the harshest of ways. Among the squalor, the faces of men and women marked by suffering drifted in and out of the fleeting warmth provided by the sparse sunbeams, each one burdened by a world that had stopped caring. In the back of an expensive car, Barron Trump sat silently, the hum of the engine and the faint sound of the radio fading into the background. His thoughts were far away, stirred by the memories of a life that seemed to him, in that very moment, distant and almost unattainable. Life had been comfortable for him, provided by privilege and ease. He was accustomed to a world that had doors already open, a world where the whispers of possibility were only a breath away. Yet today, something was different. His eyes wandered out the window and took in the streets of Skid Row, where the grim reality of life unfolded like a story he had heard only in passing, a reality that seemed worlds away from his own. It was amidst this grim scene that something caught his eye. His gaze stopped abruptly as he saw a woman, hunched and fragile, wrapped in a tattered blanket. She was trying to shield herself from the biting wind, her hands trembling as she held the blanket in place, fighting against the relentless chill. She was a shadow of what she had once been, her face marked by time and sorrow. The sight struck him, an uncomfortable stirring deep in his chest. He had seen many faces in the streets before, strangers, beggars, the forgotten. But something about this woman felt different. Her presence felt familiar, almost painfully so. Barron frowned, trying to understand the cause of the strange feeling, the tightness in his chest that had suddenly come over him. He could not explain it. Life was unpredictable, but why did this woman, this nameless soul in the cold, leave him feeling so unsettled? He could feel the unease grow in his stomach, gnawing at him, but he couldn't pull away from the vision of her huddled there in the cold. For a long moment, he simply watched, his thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. There was a sense of helplessness, the sensation that perhaps he could do nothing. But then, something changed within him. In the silence of that car, as the vehicle slowed to a red light, Barron's eyes locked onto her face again. It was then that the answer came crashing down on him with such force it took his breath away. This woman, this figure of suffering, was someone he had known. His heart skipped a beat. It was Mrs. Henderson. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt, the memory rushing back in full force. Mrs. Henderson was his childhood teacher, the woman who had shaped his early years, the one who had believed in him when he had little belief in himself. How could this be? How could someone who had touched so many lives, who had poured herself into her students with dedication and warmth, end up here, on the streets of Skid Row? The shock was nearly overwhelming. Barron blinked repeatedly, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. There had to be some mistake, he thought. But as he looked deeper into her weathered face, there was no mistaking it. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had taught him how to read, how to dream, how to reach beyond himself, had somehow fallen through the cracks of the world. In that moment, a wave of profound sadness washed over him. How had the world allowed this to happen? How could a society that cherished its heroes, its educators, let someone like her be abandoned to such a fate? Barron felt a deep, suffocating weight on his chest. This wasn't just a tragedy for one person. It was a tragedy for all of humanity, a stark reminder of how easily life could change. One moment, everything is in place, and the next, everything you once knew is shattered. The car eased to a stop at the light, but Barron couldn't bring himself to look away. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing. A battle raged within him. One voice told him to keep driving, to turn away, to retreat back into the comfort of his life. After all, he was just one person. What could he possibly do for a woman like her, a woman who had already suffered so much? But another voice, quieter but stronger, urged him to act. The voice told him he had to do something. He couldn't walk away. Not from her. Not from the pain in her eyes that seemed to call out to him. Barron knew the reality of his world. He knew how easily everything could slip away. He had grown up with privilege, yes, but life could change in the blink of an eye. What if the roles were reversed? What if it was him on the street, forgotten, abandoned? What if he was the one left with nothing but a tattered blanket to shield him from the cold winds of the world? The thought was too much to bear. He couldn't just look away. With the car still at a stop, Barron quickly gave the driver a terse instruction, his voice tight with emotion. "Pull over. Now." The driver hesitated for a moment but complied. As the vehicle slid to the curb, Barron threw open the door and stepped out onto the cold concrete. His breath came out in a visible mist, the winter air biting at his skin, but he barely noticed it. His eyes were fixed on Mrs. Henderson, and as he walked toward her, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. He didn't know what he was going to say, or how he could possibly help, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to try. Mrs. Henderson didn't seem to notice him at first. She was sitting on the pavement, her back hunched and her head bowed, trying in vain to shield herself from the elements. Barron stood there for a moment, watching her, until the stillness of the scene overwhelmed him. He crouched down slowly in front of her, his heart beating loudly in his chest, and called her name. Mrs. Henderson. At the sound of her name, she lifted her head, her eyes meeting his with a flicker of recognition that quickly gave way to disbelief. She blinked, trying to make sense of the figure standing before her. Barron could see the confusion and the rawness of her emotions reflected in her face, but he saw something else too, something that broke his heart. There was a faint glimmer of hope, a small spark of something that she had long since abandoned. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her, let alone someone from her past. "Barron," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and disbelief. Barron nodded, his throat tightening as he took in the sight of the woman who had once stood in front of a classroom full of eager children, teaching them the lessons of life. He felt the lump in his throat grow as he reached out to her. "It's me," he said softly. "It's Barron." Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in so long, she allowed herself to cry. She didn't speak at first, overwhelmed by the kindness in his voice, by the realization that someone from her past, had remembered her. But Barron wasn't done yet. He wasn't just there to offer kind words. He was there to do something more. "Come with me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm not leaving you here. You're not alone." In the weeks that followed, Barron did more than just offer help. He made sure Mrs. Henderson had a home, medical care, and support. His actions sparked something in the people around him, a ripple effect that reminded everyone of the power of compassion, of how one person's kindness could change the course of another's life. It wasn't just about money or resources. It was about seeing someone, truly seeing them, and understanding that everyone, no matter where they come from or where they've been, deserves a chance. Barron had learned something profound in that moment on Skid Row. Life could change in the blink of an eye, but so too could compassion. He had seen his former teacher in the depths of despair, and instead of turning away, he had chosen to act. And in doing so, he had helped restore a sense of dignity to someone who had once given so much to him. As the days passed, the quiet promise Barron had made to Mrs. Henderson began to ripple through the lives of those around him. It wasn't just about the immediate act of helping her. It was about awakening something deeper within him, something he hadn't known had been dormant for so long. In his past, his world had been one of comfort and certainty, where the lines between right and wrong seemed neatly drawn, and solutions were always within reach. But what had started as an unexpected encounter in the cold, harsh streets of Skid Row had opened his eyes to the true meaning of compassion, a compassion that reached beyond mere gestures of charity. Barron was no longer content to simply be a passive observer in a world filled with suffering. His experience with Mrs. Henderson and the memory of the teacher who had shaped so much of his childhood became the driving force behind his desire to make lasting change. He had learned a painful truth. No one was exempt from the whims of fate, not even those who had once stood tall, filled with purpose and hope. If the world could leave someone like Mrs. Henderson behind, then it could happen to anyone. It was in the quiet moments of reflection, when Barron sat with her in the small, modest home he had arranged for her, that he truly grasped the depth of her pain. He would sit across from her at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hand, listening to her stories of days gone by, of the children she had taught, and the lessons she had imparted. Mrs. Henderson would talk of her early years as an educator, the joy she found in seeing her students grow, and how she had poured her heart into her work. But there was a haunting sorrow in her voice when she spoke of the present, the loneliness, the desperation, and the overwhelming feeling of being forgotten. Barron learned that Mrs. Henderson had been more than just a teacher. She had been a beacon of hope to many, someone who inspired students not only to excel in academics, but to embrace the world with kindness and integrity. She had always been more than a role model. She had been a mother figure to those who needed one most. And yet, after a sudden illness and the devastating loss of her husband, she had found herself abandoned, not by the world she had so carefully nurtured, but by those she had trusted most. Her children, the very ones she had sacrificed for, had turned away when she needed them the most. The isolation was suffocating, and as time wore on, the woman who had once given everything to others found herself struggling to hold on to the pieces of her broken life. But Barron saw something more than despair in her eyes. He saw strength. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the hardship, Mrs. Henderson had not given up. She had fought, even if it was just to survive. And it was that strength, that resilience, that moved Barron more than anything else. She was not just a victim of circumstance. She was a survivor, a fighter who had endured unimaginable losses, yet still clung to the hope that one day things might get better. Her spirit, though battered, had not been broken. Barron became her anchor, a lifeline she had never expected to find. In the beginning, he wasn't sure how to help, unsure of the right way to ease her suffering. But as the weeks unfolded, he realized that sometimes the greatest help wasn't in the tangible things. It wasn't the money or the material comforts, though they certainly made a difference. The greatest help was in the act of seeing her for who she truly was, a woman worthy of respect and dignity, someone who had shaped countless lives and deserved to be treated as such. Barron took it upon himself to reconnect Mrs. Henderson with her former students, reaching out to them one by one. Slowly but surely, the faces of the children she had once taught began to reappear in her life. Some were now adults with families of their own. Others had followed their dreams and carved out successful careers. But each one had a story to share of how Mrs. Henderson had touched their lives. Barron had no idea how many people she had truly impacted until he began to hear the stories of gratitude and admiration that poured in from every direction. Mrs. Henderson had been more than a teacher to them. She had been a lifeline, a guide in moments of uncertainty, a voice of reason in times of chaos. These reunions were not just about rekindling old friendships or catching up on lost time. They were about healing, both for Mrs. Henderson and for those she had taught. It became clear to Barron that what Mrs. Henderson had given to the world wasn't simply knowledge. She had given a piece of herself to each person who had walked into her classroom. And now, it was time for the world to return that gift, to offer her the support and care she had long since stopped expecting. But as he watched Mrs. Henderson begin to regain a sense of purpose, Barron couldn't ignore the wider issue that haunted him. What had happened to so many like her? How many people were left to suffer in silence, abandoned and forgotten by a system that claimed to care for them? Barron knew that Mrs. Henderson's story wasn't an isolated case. It was a reflection of a much larger problem. There were countless people, elderly, sick, or simply down on their luck, who found themselves discarded by a society that had no time for them. This realization stirred something within him, something deeper than he had ever anticipated. He couldn't just help one person and walk away. The problem was bigger than that. Determined to do more, Barron began to investigate the systems that had failed people like Mrs. Henderson. He met with social workers, community leaders, and local activists to understand how people ended up on Skid Row, how lives could unravel so quickly, and what could be done to prevent it. What he learned shocked him. It wasn't just the lack of affordable housing or health care that created these problems. It was the lack of compassion, the way society had stopped caring about the most vulnerable members of its population. People like Mrs. Henderson, who had spent their lives giving to others, found themselves abandoned when they needed help the most. Barron knew he couldn't fix everything, but he could start somewhere. He could use his position to bring attention to the issue, to advocate for the changes that were desperately needed. And so, he threw himself into the work, working with nonprofits, organizing rallies, and speaking out about the need for systemic change. He became an unexpected advocate for the homeless, the elderly, and the forgotten members of society. It wasn't easy. He faced criticism and pushback from those who saw the problem as something too complex to solve, too entrenched to change. But Barron didn't back down. He couldn't. He had seen firsthand what happened when people were left to fend for themselves, when the world turned a blind eye to their suffering. Through it all, Barron kept Mrs. Henderson close. She became his inspiration, the constant reminder of why he had to keep going. She had been lost, cast aside, but with his help and the support of others, she had found her way back. And though she had endured more hardship than anyone should ever have to, she never lost her compassion, her desire to help others. In many ways, she had come full circle, becoming a mentor once again, this time not to children, but to the adults who had found themselves in similar circumstances. One day, as Barron stood with Mrs. Henderson at one of the many rallies they had organized to raise awareness for the homeless, he looked around at the crowd of faces, some hopeful, some weary, but all determined to be seen. And in that moment, it struck him just how far they had come. He had helped one person, yes, but that one person had sparked something much greater. A movement, a cause, a call to action that could change the course of lives. Barron had started with a single act of kindness, a simple decision to help someone in need. But that act had led to something more, a transformation in both his own life and the lives of countless others. He had learned that compassion was not just a feeling. It was a force that could move mountains, heal wounds, and restore dignity. And in the process, Barron had come to understand something profound. The true measure of success in life was not what you gained, but what you gave. As Barron's journey unfolded, he began to see the world through a different lens, one that was clearer, more purposeful, and undoubtedly more compassionate. He had discovered that helping Mrs. Henderson had not only altered the course of her life, but had also unlocked something deep within him, a calling, a responsibility he had never expected to bear. The more he immersed himself in the lives of those who had fallen through the cracks, the more he realized how much the system had failed them. What had once seemed like a distant issue had become personal, something he could no longer ignore. But this path was not easy, and it was not without its obstacles. Barron quickly realized that advocating for the homeless and disenfranchised wasn't just about throwing money at the problem or donating to charities. It wasn't about feeling good for a moment and then moving on with life. No, it was about confronting the underlying issues that kept people like Mrs. Henderson, people with dignity, people who had given so much to the world, stuck in a cycle of poverty and neglect. It was about tackling systemic problems, from the lack of affordable housing to the scarcity of mental health resources, to the stigmatization of the homeless as somehow undeserving or unworthy. As Barron dove deeper into these issues, he found himself sitting at tables with policymakers, talking to local leaders, and even meeting with people who had dedicated their lives to the cause of social justice. The conversations were often frustrating. filled with red tape and bureaucracy. But Barron wasn't deterred. He knew that real change required patience, persistence, and the willingness to stand up against systems that had long been broken. The more he learned, the more he understood that real progress would come only when society as a whole began to see the humanity in those who had been discarded. Only when people like Mrs. Henderson, whose story was shared by so many, were seen not as problems, but as people who had lost their way, but who still had the potential to contribute, to heal, and to rebuild their lives. Barron was no longer the same person he had been. The encounters he had experienced, both with Mrs. Henderson and with others like her, had fundamentally altered his perception of the world. He no longer viewed the world of privilege and wealth as a guarantee. In fact, the more he saw of the lives of the less fortunate, the more he understood just how fragile the line was between success and failure. One misstep, one unexpected tragedy, and anyone could end up on the streets, alone, forgotten, and abandoned by a world that had moved on without them. The lesson was simple but profound. Life could change in an instant. The question was, when it did, would society be there to catch those who fell? As Barron worked tirelessly to bring attention to the plight of the homeless, he often found himself at the center of heated debates, especially within his own circles. Some people couldn't understand why he was dedicating so much of his time and energy to what they saw as a never-ending problem. They questioned the efficacy of his actions, the practicality of his beliefs, and even his motives. Why would someone with so much, someone who had everything at their fingertips, choose to walk down this difficult road of social reform? The question echoed in his mind, but it no longer held the power it once did. He had crossed a threshold. He had seen firsthand how much one life, one act of compassion, could ripple out and create change. The stories of those he had helped, the small victories he had witnessed, filled him with a sense of purpose that no amount of wealth or status could ever provide. But his journey was not without personal costs. As Barron continued to give more of himself to the cause, he began to notice the subtle shifts in his own life. His relationships with people who once shared his world of privilege began to change. He was no longer invited to the same parties, no longer the subject of conversation at high society events. Some of his old friends, people who had always been by his side, slowly drifted away. His commitment to the homeless and the disenfranchised was something they couldn't understand, or perhaps didn't want to understand. Their world was one of comfort and luxury, where problems were solved with money and influence, not by rolling up your sleeves and confronting uncomfortable truths. Barron didn't blame them. They had simply never seen what he had seen. They hadn't experienced the rawness, the visceral pain of what it meant to watch someone struggle, to see them lose everything, and to know that the odds were stacked so high against them that survival itself was a victory. But it wasn't just the social distance that began to affect him. It was the weight of the cause itself. Barron was increasingly aware of how much work remained to be done. Despite the successes he had had, his ability to secure funding for shelters, his advocacy for mental health programs, his push for reforms in housing policy, he knew that the road ahead was long and uncertain. He had witnessed firsthand the crushing reality of systemic issues, and he understood that they wouldn't be solved overnight. He had become deeply frustrated by the bureaucracy, by the slow pace of change, and by the constant fight to keep the issue in the public eye. Every victory, no matter how small, seemed to be followed by 2 more setbacks. For every family he helped get back on their feet, there were dozens more that fell into the cracks, slipping further into despair. Yet despite all of this, there was one truth that continued to fuel him. It was worth it. The struggle was worth it. The sleepless nights spent organizing, the meetings with legislators who had no interest in making real change, the frustrations of not being able to do enough. Barron began to see them, not as obstacles but as part of the journey. He knew that the pain of fighting for a cause so big, so complex, was not something to be avoided. It was a necessary part of the process. Change was never easy. True change required sacrifice. persistence, and the willingness to fight even when the odds were stacked against you. As the months turned into years, Barron's efforts began to bear fruit in ways he hadn't anticipated. The once quiet campaign for social reform grew into a movement, a collective voice of people who had all been touched by the same problem. More and more individuals began to see the issue of homelessness not as an isolated issue, but as a societal one. Politicians who had once dismissed the cause began to listen, recognizing the growing public support and the undeniable truth that something had to change. Charities and nonprofits that had once been fighting for scraps were now being given the resources they needed to truly make a difference. Barron's voice, once an echo in the crowd, had become one of the loudest calls for reform, and with it, the tide was beginning to turn. One day, after a particularly difficult meeting with a group of lawmakers, Barron received a call from Mrs. Henderson. Her voice, warm and steady, filled his ears as she thanked him for everything he had done. For her, and for so many others, she had been through so much in her life, and yet now she was beginning to feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She had found a community, a place where she belonged, where she was no longer invisible. She no longer saw herself as a victim, but as someone who had fought back against the odds, who had been given a second chance. "Barron," she said softly, "you've shown me what it means to not just survive, but to live again." And in that moment, Barron realized the true power of what he had done. He hadn't just helped her get back on her feet. He had helped her reclaim her dignity, her hope, and her purpose. That was the heart of the work. It wasn't just about the physical necessities. It was about restoring people's humanity, about giving them the strength to rise above their circumstances and reclaim their lives. Barron's journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But he knew, deep in his heart, that the work he had started was the most important thing he could ever do. It was more than a cause. It was a mission, and he would see it through to the end, no matter how long it took, no matter how hard it became. Because in the end, it was about more than just changing the world. It was about making sure that no one, no matter their circumstances, was ever forgotten again. As the years wore on, Barron's commitment to the cause grew deeper, more ingrained in the very fabric of who he had become. What had started as a personal response to an unexpected encounter had transformed into a lifelong mission, one that was intertwined with every aspect of his identity. The quiet days of self-reflection and the long nights spent advocating for change were no longer tasks to be completed. They had become a calling, a purpose that filled his every thought and every action. He no longer saw the world as a series of unrelated events, but as a vast network of interconnected lives, each one deserving of the same respect and opportunity as the next. And it was this realization that guided him forward. Barron knew that in order to achieve true change, he had to go beyond the surface-level fixes that so many organizations had settled for. He understood that it wasn't enough to simply house people or provide food for a day. The real work was in addressing the roots of the problem. It was about dismantling the systems that kept the most vulnerable people in perpetual cycles of poverty and hopelessness. Housing wasn't enough without healthcare. Healthcare wasn't enough without employment opportunities. And employment wasn't enough if the stigma of homelessness followed people everywhere they went. Barron had come to understand that the key to true reform was a comprehensive approach, one that took into account not just the physical needs of people, but their emotional, mental, and social needs as well. As he worked tirelessly to bring these ideas to life, Barron began to develop relationships with experts in various fields. He became friends with social workers who specialized in trauma recovery, healthcare providers who focused on the underprivileged, and even corporate leaders who were willing to invest in long-term social change. These relationships were the foundation upon which his vision for a better world would grow. Each of these people brought a unique perspective, but what they all shared was a common belief in the potential of every person, no matter their past, no matter their circumstances. They believed that with the right resources, support, and compassion, people could rise above their challenges and build better lives. Barron's approach to reform was holistic. He didn't just focus on one area. He sought to create a network of services that would help people at every stage of their recovery. He worked with developers to create affordable housing that would not only give people a roof over their heads, but also offer a sense of stability and security. He partnered with hospitals and clinics to provide free medical care to those who couldn't afford it. He fought for access to mental health services for individuals who had experienced trauma or who were struggling with addiction. And most importantly, he worked with local businesses to create job training programs, internships, and employment opportunities for people who had been out of work for years, sometimes decades. But as his initiatives began to take shape, Barron was confronted with the harsh reality that change was never as simple as just putting plans into action. Every step forward was met with resistance. The local government, for all its talk about wanting to solve the homelessness crisis, was slow to act. Bureaucracy stifled progress, and funding for projects was often delayed or denied. Even some of the businesses he approached were hesitant, unwilling to take the risk of hiring individuals who had been homeless for years. It was disheartening, and there were moments when Barron wondered if the uphill battle was worth it. But in those moments of doubt, he found strength in the people he had met along the way. People like Mrs. Henderson, who had refused to give up, and the countless others whose stories of resilience had touched him deeply. One such story that kept him going was that of Marcus, a man Barron had met early on in his advocacy work. Marcus had lived on the streets for over a decade, battling addiction, mental illness, and the overwhelming weight of rejection from society. When Barron first encountered him, Marcus was living in a small tent on the outskirts of Skid Row, struggling just to survive another day. But what set Marcus apart from so many others was his deep desire to change. Despite everything he had been through, he had not lost hope. He wanted to work, to rebuild his life, but he had no idea where to begin. Barron took a special interest in Marcus. He arranged for him to get the medical treatment he needed, enrolled him in a job training program, and connected him with a mentor who had once been in his shoes. Over the course of several months, Marcus began to transform. His addiction was no longer the driving force in his life. He began to find purpose in the work he was doing, slowly but surely regaining his self-worth. Eventually, Marcus landed a job at a local manufacturing plant, a steady, reliable source of income that allowed him to get back on his feet. One afternoon, as Barron visited Marcus at his new apartment, an apartment he had earned, not been given, he saw something that made the years of struggle and frustration seem worthwhile. Marcus, standing proudly in the doorway, smiled and offered Barron a cup of coffee. It was a simple gesture, but to Barron, it was a symbol of everything he had worked for: the reclaiming of dignity, the rediscovery of hope, and the realization that no one was truly beyond help. "Thank you," Marcus said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never thought this day would come, but here I am. Here we are." Barron couldn't help but smile back, his heart swelling with pride. He had helped one person, yes, but in doing so, he had ignited a spark in Marcus that would burn for years to come. And in a way, Marcus's success was a reflection of the larger movement that was slowly, painstakingly, taking shape around him. The ripple effect was beginning to spread. More people were finding jobs, more families were finding stability, and the sense of hopelessness that had once hung over the streets of Skid Row was beginning to lift, however slowly. Barron knew that the work was far from finished. There were still so many people to help, so many lives to change. But in that moment, standing in Marcus's doorway, he felt a deep sense of gratitude and fulfillment. He had found something that transcended personal success, something far more meaningful. He had found purpose in helping others find their way, and in doing so, he had discovered the true power of community, compassion, and persistence. As the months turned into years, Barron's influence continued to grow, and so did his commitment to the cause. He became a voice for the voiceless, using his platform to advocate for policies that would provide lasting solutions to homelessness, poverty, and inequality. He spoke out about the importance of mental health care, the need for addiction recovery programs, and the importance of creating a society that treated everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. Barron's efforts were not without sacrifice. He lost friends, faced public scrutiny, and encountered roadblocks that seemed insurmountable. But the victories, no matter how small, kept him moving forward. Each time a person regained their footing, each time a family found shelter, each time a community came together to support the most vulnerable members, Barron was reminded of why he had chosen this path. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about making a difference, about leaving a legacy of compassion and change. And so, Barron continued his work, unwavering in his belief that every life mattered, that no one was beyond redemption, and that true change could only come when people united in a common cause. The road ahead was still long, but with each step, Barron knew that the world was becoming a little bit better, a little bit kinder, and a little bit more just. He had started with one woman, one teacher who had shaped his life, and now he was part of something much bigger, a movement that had the power to change the world, one life at a time. Barron's commitment to the cause was no longer just a personal endeavor. It had evolved into something that had transcended his own life and aspirations. The movement he had started, sparked by a chance encounter with his former teacher on the cold streets of Skid Row, had grown into a powerful force that was challenging the very foundations of a society that had long turned its back on the most vulnerable. The battle was far from over, but Barron now had the clarity and the determination to push forward, knowing that the work he was doing would impact generations to come. As the years unfolded, Barron's journey became one not only of fighting for others, but also of self-discovery. He had changed in ways he had never expected. In the early days of his advocacy, he had been driven by the need to help, to fix what was broken. But as he dug deeper into the issue, he realized that true change wasn't about providing quick solutions or temporary fixes. It was about fostering a cultural shift, a movement in which people were empowered to not only change their own lives, but to become a part of the collective effort that sought to heal the fractures in society. Barron spent countless hours meeting with those who had lived through the trauma of homelessness, seeking to understand their experiences and the complex web of issues that had led them to where they were. He listened, truly listened, to the stories of people who had faced unimaginable hardships, yet still found ways to survive. He learned about the deep psychological scars that came from years of neglect and rejection, and the difficult journey of healing that many had to undertake simply to regain a sense of self-worth. He listened to the mothers who had lost their children to the system, the fathers who had been cast aside because they had nowhere to turn, and the young people whose hopes and dreams had been suffocated by circumstances beyond their control. And with each story, Barron's resolve grew stronger. He knew that these individuals didn't need to be saved or pitied. They needed to be seen, heard, and supported. They didn't need charity. They needed opportunity. They needed the same chances that everyone else had to rebuild their lives, to access resources, to find work, and to heal. And most importantly, they needed the dignity that had been stripped away from them by a society that had deemed them invisible. As his perspective shifted, so did his approach to advocacy. Barron began to shift the conversation, challenging the narrative that homelessness was a personal failure or a moral shortcoming. Instead, he worked to create a national dialogue about the root causes of homelessness: systemic inequality, lack of affordable housing, inadequate mental health services, and a broken criminal justice system that disproportionately impacted the most marginalized communities. He understood that homelessness wasn't just an issue of the individual. It was an issue of the structures and systems that had been designed to perpetuate inequality. But even as Barron's understanding of the issue deepened, the road to change was never easy. The systems in place were deeply entrenched, and those who had benefited from the status quo often fought to maintain it. Corporate interests, politicians, and even some well-meaning organizations resisted the larger-scale changes that Barron and his allies called for, arguing that they would be too costly or too difficult to implement. Some dismissed the issue of homelessness as too complex, too far-reaching to be addressed effectively. Barron, however, refused to be deterred. He knew that there was no quick fix, no magic solution to the problem. But that didn't mean it couldn't be fixed. The journey toward meaningful change required persistence, strategy, and a deep commitment to justice. And Barron had all of those things. He continued to build alliances with lawmakers who shared his vision, carefully crafting legislation that would create long-term solutions. He worked with urban planners to create affordable housing projects that were not only practical but also supportive, offering not just shelter, but access to health care, job training, and community building programs. He lobbied for the inclusion of mental health services as a core component of homelessness support systems, recognizing that many individuals living on the streets were dealing with trauma that needed to be addressed before they could even begin to think about rebuilding their lives. The impact of Barron's work began to be felt in small but significant ways. Cities that had once been resistant to the idea of providing housing for the homeless began to change their approach, realizing that the benefits of supporting people in need outweigh the costs. Nonprofits, previously overwhelmed by the sheer volume of people in need, began to receive more funding and resources, allowing them to expand their programs and reach even more people. Barron's own foundation became a well-respected voice in the conversation about social justice, attracting attention from philanthropists, activists, and everyday people who wanted to make a difference. But even as these successes mounted, Barron knew that real transformation would require more than just policy changes and resource redistribution. It would require a shift in the collective mindset. He wanted to change how society viewed those experiencing homelessness. He wanted to create a world where people didn't look away or turn a blind eye when they saw someone in need. He wanted to create a world where people understood that homelessness wasn't a fate to be feared, but a reality that could happen to anyone. To do this, Barron turned to storytelling. He began working with filmmakers, writers, and artists to create powerful narratives that highlighted the humanity of those affected by homelessness. He wanted to show the world the faces behind the statistics, the people whose lives had been upended by forces beyond their control, but who still held on to hope. Through documentaries, articles, and art installations, Barron helped people see the stories of resilience and redemption that so often went unnoticed. He knew that if he could change how people saw homelessness, if he could make them feel the weight of it, understand its causes, and recognize its consequences, he could inspire them to act. One of the most powerful pieces of storytelling Barron was involved in was a documentary that followed the journey of a man named Elijah. Elijah had spent years on the streets, struggling with addiction, mental illness, and a fractured sense of self. His story was one of pain and loss, but it was also one of incredible strength. Through the support of Barron's programs, Elijah had entered recovery, found stable housing, and was now working as a mentor for others in the same position he had once been. The film chronicled his journey in intimate detail, showing the struggles, the setbacks, and the moments of triumph. It was raw, emotional, and profoundly moving. When the film was released, it had a profound impact on its audience. It garnered attention from people across the nation, sparking conversations about homelessness, mental health, and addiction. But more importantly, it inspired people to take action. Donations poured in to support the cause, and thousands of people reached out to volunteer their time, eager to help those in need. The documentary's success marked a turning point in Barron's efforts. It showed him that storytelling, when done with empathy and honesty, had the power to change hearts and minds. It had the ability to bridge the gap between the privileged and the marginalized, to inspire collective action and a renewed sense of responsibility. As Barron reflected on all that he had accomplished, on the lives he had touched, the policies he had helped to change, and the movement he had helped to create, he realized that the work was far from over. There were still millions of people struggling, still countless families living in the shadow of homelessness, still systems that needed to be dismantled. But he was no longer fighting alone. The movement had grown beyond him. and it was now a force to be reckoned with. Barron looked forward with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the path ahead would be long and winding, that the obstacles would continue to come. But he also knew that the power of empathy, the strength of community, and the force of collective action would be more than enough to carry them all forward. The journey was far from over, but the movement for change was unstoppable. And Barron, having started with one act of compassion, was now part of a larger story, one that was still being written, one that would continue to inspire and shape the future. As the years continued to unfold, Barron found himself grappling with a new phase of his journey, one where the fight for change no longer felt like a series of isolated actions, but an evolving living movement that demanded his unwavering attention and commitment. The success of the early projects and initiatives he had pioneered had been immensely rewarding. Yet Barron knew that true, sustainable change wasn't simply about creating a handful of successful programs or making headlines with high-profile initiatives. It was about creating a cultural shift that would transform society from the inside out, where the marginalized and the vulnerable were no longer treated as invisible, but as an integral part of the human fabric, deserving of respect, opportunity, and dignity. This new phase in Barron's journey was not without its challenges. Despite the progress, the road ahead remained difficult. The political landscape was as polarized as ever, and while there were pockets of support for homelessness reform, there were still powerful forces working to maintain the status quo. Bureaucracy, entrenched interests, and the pervasive stigma against homelessness continued to present formidable barriers. Yet Barron had come to understand that true transformation would never come from one initiative or one policy. It would come from an unyielding dedication to reshaping the culture, one conversation, one person, and one act of compassion at a time. To keep momentum, Barron began focusing on long-term education and awareness campaigns. He recognized that the public's perceptions about homelessness were skewed by stereotypes and misinformation. It was all too easy to dismiss those experiencing homelessness as lazy, unmotivated, or deserving of their plight. These narratives were deeply ingrained in society and stood in stark opposition to the truth. The truth was that homelessness was a complex issue, driven by factors like economic inequality, a lack of affordable housing, systemic failures in healthcare and the criminal justice system, and perhaps most insidiously, a failure of empathy. Barron's efforts to shift this cultural narrative began with something simple: conversations. Conversations that humanized the issue, that told the stories of individuals, not as statistics, but as real people with dreams, families, and aspirations. He partnered with a network of storytellers, influencers, and educators to launch a multimedia campaign that would reach people where they were, whether on social media, through documentaries, or through local community outreach. These conversations made people uncomfortable. They forced people to confront their biases and reflect on the ways they had been complicit in perpetuating inequality. But these conversations also opened hearts and minds. The more people listened to the stories of those who had lived through the devastating consequences of homelessness, the more they began to understand that anyone could be one step away from crisis. The campaign quickly gained traction. The messages resonated far beyond the expected circles of advocacy groups, attracting people from all walks of life: parents, students, business owners, and even those who had previously believed that homelessness was something that happened to other people. The stories began to circulate, both online and in the media, sparking widespread conversations in living rooms, at kitchen tables, and in boardrooms. People who had once never thought twice about homelessness were now asking questions. What could they do to help? How could they contribute to the solution? Where did the cycle of poverty and homelessness begin, and how could it be broken? Barron felt both a deep sense of accomplishment and an overwhelming responsibility as he watched the movement grow. This wasn't just about changing policy or providing services. It was about creating a world where every person, no matter their circumstances, was seen and valued. It was about challenging societal norms that dehumanized the most vulnerable and replacing them with a culture of care, empathy, and collective responsibility. It wasn't long before Barron's vision began to extend beyond the borders of his own country. He had received invitations to speak at international forums, summits, and conferences focused on global social issues. The interconnectedness of homelessness, poverty, mental health, and systemic inequality was not confined to one region or one nation. It was a universal issue, one that spanned continents and cultures, and Barron was now part of a larger global conversation about how to address it. As he traveled, he found that the challenges faced by people experiencing homelessness were often strikingly similar, whether in the crowded streets of Los Angeles, the harsh winters of Eastern Europe, or the sprawling slums of the developing world. In one particular instance, Barron traveled to South America, where he was invited to speak at a conference on urban poverty. It was there that he met Valeria, a woman who had lived on the streets of Lima for nearly a decade. Valeria's story mirrored those of so many others Barron had met along the way. She had lost her home after a series of tragic events, including the death of her mother and the loss of her job, and had ended up living in a public park. Her resilience, however, was remarkable. Despite the many hardships she had faced, Valeria had never lost her sense of dignity or her desire to help others in her situation. She had organized a small group of homeless women in the park to provide mutual support, sharing food, clothing, and resources. They created a community within the confines of their circumstances, offering each other encouragement and solidarity. Valeria's story was a powerful reminder that no matter where people lived, the human spirit could withstand the most dire of situations. She had found strength in the very place where most people saw only suffering and despair. Barron was deeply moved by her journey and felt a renewed sense of purpose in his own work. He realized that the issues faced by those experiencing homelessness were not confined to Western nations or urban centers. They were global problems, and the solutions had to be universal. Inspired by his experiences abroad, Barron returned to the U.S. with a new vision, one that sought to build a global coalition of advocates, organizations, and individuals united by a common goal: to end homelessness. He began to create cross-border partnerships, working with international organizations and grassroots movements to develop a shared framework for tackling the issue on a global scale. This effort would require not just resources, but a complete overhaul of how society approached the problem. It was about breaking down national barriers and creating a collective, worldwide effort to support the most vulnerable. Barron's efforts were met with resistance in some quarters. Some critics argued that homelessness was too complex and varied to be addressed with a one-size-fits-all approach. They pointed out the differences in economic, social, and political structures between countries and questioned whether the same strategies could be applied universally. Barron understood these concerns, but he also believed that, at its core, homelessness was not just a set of logistical challenges, it was a human issue. And that meant the solutions had to be rooted in compassion, justice, and the belief that every person, no matter where they came from or what they had lost, deserved a chance to rebuild their life. As the coalition grew, Barron began to see tangible results. More countries began to adopt policies that supported the homeless, not just with shelters, but with long-term solutions such as job training, mental health services, and affordable housing. Cities that had once resisted providing services for their homeless populations began to realize that their efforts were more successful when they worked collaboratively with the community, rather than pushing people to the margins. Barron's work was proving that when people came together, when governments, organizations, and individuals were united by a shared vision, real change was possible. The movement was no longer just about providing a safety net for those who had fallen through the cracks. It was about building a society where no one had to fall through the cracks in the first place. It was about creating systems that supported people from the beginning, preventing homelessness before it started by addressing the root causes of poverty, mental illness, and inequality. Through his international work, Barron also realized that the issue of homelessness could not be separated from larger global issues like climate change, refugees, and economic inequality. The same forces that drove people into homelessness in one part of the world often had far-reaching effects in other regions. A warming planet, rising sea levels, and natural disasters displaced millions of people each year. Wars and conflicts forced families to flee their homes and seek refuge in overcrowded camps. Barron's work began to expand beyond homelessness in its traditional sense into the broader context of social justice, environmental sustainability, and human rights. But no matter how far the movement reached, Barron never forgot its origins. His commitment remained rooted in the individual stories, the faces of the people he had met along the way. From Mrs. Henderson on the cold streets of Los Angeles to Valeria in the parks of Lima, it was their strength, their humanity, that continued to drive him forward. And as he looked back on all he had achieved, he understood that the movement was not about him. It was about the people whose voices had long been silenced, and the collective power that could change the world when people came together to listen, to care, and to act. As the movement for change continued to gather momentum, Barron stood at a crossroads. He had accomplished so much. He had helped create a global dialogue about homelessness, transformed policies, and perhaps most importantly, had inspired a collective consciousness that believed in the dignity and potential of every human being, no matter their circumstances. But the journey, as it always is in matters of true change, was never ending. Barron knew there would always be work to do. The road to justice and equality would never be fully paved, and the fight against systemic inequality would always require vigilance. Yet, as he reflected on the many lives that had been touched along the way, those whose voices had once been silenced and whose dreams had once seemed unattainable, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had seen the impact of his work ripple outward, not just in policy changes or new laws, but in the lives of individuals who had found their footing again, who had been given the tools to rebuild, and who had regained their hope. It was never just about providing food or shelter. It had always been about restoring dignity, about reminding people, often for the first time in their lives, that they were worthy of love, respect, and a second chance. Barron had learned, through years of working side by side with those who had suffered, that real change happened not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday acts of kindness. It happened when one person reached out to another, saw them for who they truly were, and offered them a chance at a better life. Barron's life had changed forever that cold day on Skid Row, when he had seen Mrs. Henderson, his former teacher, shivering in a tattered blanket. He had never imagined that moment would serve as the catalyst for everything that followed, but it had. It had opened his eyes to the fragility of human existence, to the reality that anyone, no matter how successful, no matter how secure, could one day be stripped of everything. But Barron had also learned that the key to survival was community. He had watched people like Marcus and Valeria find strength not in isolation, but in the support and love of others who had faced similar struggles. The power of a community to heal, to offer second chances, and to uplift those who had fallen was a truth that would guide him forever. As Barron's efforts began to shift from individual programs to systemic change, from addressing immediate needs to creating long-term solutions, he realized that the true measure of success was not just in the number of people helped, but in the collective belief that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and compassionate world. The lesson Barron learned, and the one he wanted to impart to others, was that change starts with one small act of kindness, one moment of recognition, and one decision to see beyond the surface of a person's situation. It's easy to be overwhelmed by the enormity of the problems facing the world, but Barron had seen time and time again that small, compassionate actions could snowball into something larger than anyone could have imagined. A single spark of kindness could light a fire of change. As the years passed, Barron continued to do the work that mattered most to him, but he also took time to reflect. He spent more time with his family, with friends, and with the very people who had inspired him to fight. He took long walks through the communities he had helped to rebuild, watching the streets once filled with despair now brimming with hope. And in those moments, he would often pause and take it all in, knowing that although the road had been long, the journey had been worth it. In the end, Barron realized that the world would never be free of suffering, nor would it be without those who had fallen through the cracks. But what mattered was that, together, they could build a world where fewer people had to fall at all. They could create a world where kindness and compassion were not afterthoughts, but foundations upon which society was built. Barron's journey had begun with one person, one teacher, but it had grown into a movement of many, of countless people working together to create lasting change. And as he looked out at the world, he understood that this was just the beginning. The work, while difficult and at times discouraging, was a privilege. And if there was one thing he had learned from those he had helped, it was that no act of kindness, no matter how small, was ever wasted. And so, Barron continued forward, knowing that while the battle was long, the fight for dignity, equality, and justice would always be worth the effort. The work was never about what he had accomplished alone. It was about the collective movement, the collective will to see others rise, to see communities heal, and to create a world where everyone had a place. For Barron, the lesson was simple but profound. Change begins with compassion. And as long as that fire burned, there would always be hope, always be progress, and always be the possibility of a better future for all. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.